about the monarchy, which nobody understands, is that the Queen does nothing herself at all. She doesn't dissolve Parliament, she doesn't summon Parliament, she doesn't appoint Prime Ministers, she doesn't enact legislation, and yet the Crown, as an institution, has got enormous power. For example, every member of Parliament on election has to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen, and if he doesn't, he's fined £500 and there's a by-election to replace him. So it's a very strange phenomenon.
Of course, we don't know what happens in these private audiences between the Prime Minister and the Queen. Every week they have to occur, no matter how busy the Prime Minister is. But I wonder whether sometimes the Queen kind of puts the opposite idea, plays a little bit of a devil's advocate, and to an extent I think she does see herself as the voice of her people. I mean, that's how she sees herself. I'm not sure.
So she reflects the nation?
I think she feels she does, because she tours, she meets many people. Of course, people write to her. A little pupil wrote to her last year who didn't get into his first choice school, and she passed a letter to Michael Gove. So people may disagree with her view of that, but I think that's what she thinks she does. So she takes her responsibility to advise and counsel very seriously.
The Queen's in a special position. She doesn't discuss politics, although she goes and has an audience with the Prime Minister every week. I mean, this Queen has spoken to, I think he's 12 Prime Ministers over 60 years. So she has a lot of experience and knows what goes on, but she wouldn't give an opinion. I mean, Prime Ministers will look at everything in terms of whether it helps them or not. And I dare say the Prime Minister thinks that a picture of himself with the Queen in the Cabinet room would be an advantage. Whether it is or not, I doubt.
The group of people that is around us all worked in financial stability.
It's a formal position, but I mean, in terms of the popularity of the royal family, as you said, I think of the royal family as a sort of national soap opera. We all know about them, and we know about the children and the marriages and everything, and we have the royal family as such.
Of the Queen is to be politically neutral, and this one has perfected it. I mean, we have very little idea about what she thinks about.
In the City of London, it's money that normally does the talking. But on their visit to the Bank of England, it was what the Queen and Duke of Edinburgh said that has got everyone chatting. After having been guided through the bank's gold vault, the Queen finally got an answer to a question she controversially posed 4 years ago. Here at a visit to the London School of Economics in 2008, she was heard asking why nobody noticed the economic downturn coming. Back to today, and
he and his group here are going to answer your question from 4 years ago, why nobody saw the crisis coming.
And after a brief explanation, another question, this time from the Duke.
There's another one coming.
But the Queen, it seemed, was engaged and had plenty to say on the matter.
It's very difficult to foresee. But people have got a bit lax, you know?
Complacency.
And then a question about the city's regulator.
Yes, because the financial service, what do they call themselves? The regulator.
Financial Services
Authority. Which was really quite new, wasn't it? Really. But it didn't have any teeth, I suppose.
These are sensitive issues, and while couched largely in question form, the comments may be seen as interference.
She's asking the sort of questions that anybody else would ask. Anybody who is in business, anybody who is suffering as a result of the credit squeeze, anybody who is in debt, anybody who really is struggling, they would ask the same questions. It just so happens it was the Queen at the Bank of England. She had a captive audience in the very people that run the economy, so why not ask the questions?
In this case, the questions have resulted in a statement from the Financial Services Authority, in which they say, "We've widely acknowledged that the regulatory approach before the financial crisis in 2008 was flawed and has since been completely changed. Parliament is now awaiting royal assent for the Financial Services Bill."
It is highly unusual, but the Queen has paid a visit to number 10 Downing Street today to sit in on the first cabinet meeting of her 60-year reign. The meeting, thought to be the first attended by a monarch since Queen Victoria in peacetime, was organised to mark her Diamond Jubilee.
Don't know what goes on in cabinet meetings. Indeed, MPs don't know. It's really only the ministers who know, and of course the Queen sees the minutes, and we don't exactly know what happens there.
So the Prime Minister escorting Her Majesty into number 10, surely just behind Sir Christopher Gite, the Queen's private secretary. The door almost closed on him, but fortunately let in as well. He'll be accompanying her throughout the visit.
Queen Elizabeth land, and this map illustrates where it is.
169,000 square miles of British Antarctica, named after the Queen.
Of the Queen is to be politically neutral, and this one has perfected it. I mean, we have very little idea about what she thinks about anything. So when something is leaked, for example, Frank Gardner suggesting her thoughts about Abu Hamza, it is rather a moment, you know, as was suggested at the time. And her role is to be politically neutral, to not get involved in party politics, to go through her prime ministers. You know, she's had 12, began with Winston Churchill. And what interests me when you look through the different accounts of the prime ministers and their advisors is how they often tend to think that the Queen is on the other side. So a lot of the Tory prime ministers have thought she's rather too left-wing. As you say, Mrs Thatcher thought she was meddling a little bit in considering about the poor, and indeed Mrs Thatcher said that the Queen is the type of woman to vote SDP, which is obviously beyond the pale. And Labour prime ministers have thought that she's a rather too right-wing. And I wonder whether this is because, of course, we don't know what happens in these private audiences between the prime minister and the Queen. Every week they have to occur, no matter how busy the prime minister is. But I wonder whether sometimes the Queen kind of puts the opposite idea, plays a little bit of a devil's advocate, and to an extent I think she does see herself as the voice of her people. I mean, that's how she sees herself. I'm not sure.
So she reflects the nation?
I think she feels she does, because she tours, she meets many people. Of course, people write to her. A little pupil wrote to her last year who didn't get into his first choice school, and she passed the letter to Michael Gove. So people may disagree with her view of that, but I think that's what she thinks she does. So she takes her responsibility to advise and counsel very seriously.
Several times during the war, but we think that the last time the monarch attended a cabinet was in 1781, proved slightly since then, and I'm going to be speaking to President Obama on a video conference this afternoon, so we'll crack on with a proper cabinet agenda, which starts with the parliamentary business and the chief
honourable strengthens the ISC. When we come back after the recess, we've got time.
Sat there and politely listened. She didn't ask any questions because, of course, as head of state, she has to remain politically neutral. But we did get to hear a bit about what cabinet ministers were discussing. Among the things were the changes to the new accession rules for the royal family. This is so that if the Duke and Duchess of Cambridge have a baby girl, that girl could become heir to the throne even if she has a younger brother.
Here's the Cabinet. I do think very strongly the Cabinet minutes should be published. The Parliament's published, so you know what's discussed in Parliament, and yet the decisions are made in Cabinet. And I think if we knew what was discussed in Cabinet and who said what, it would enormously inform the public and they would be able to reach a much clearer view when they vote.
Particularly today's Cabinet. But
her popularity has been soaring this year. I mean, the popularity of the royal family is really as high as it had been since she came to the throne in 1952, so we've seen her popularity soar in 2012, whereas we've seen that of the coalition government rather plunge. And I think this kind of present to her in her Jubilee year, this kind of ceremonial visit, as Tony says, partly a social visit, was something that brings a lot of attention, of course, to the business of government, brings a lot of attention to David Cameron.
Yes, this was a very reverential visit. You could see that the cabinet ministers were very pleased to have her there, but they did also look slightly awkward at times. She exchanged a few words with the Chancellor of the Exchequer, reminding him that she'd been to the Bank of England last week and observed the gold bars that they have in the vaults there.
The Prime Minister was taking her along the line, introducing each member of the Cabinet one by one, but he didn't introduce George Osborne for some reason. So Her Majesty the Queen says, someone, and everyone laughs, because clearly that was because David Cameron had forgotten to introduce him. But she then asks the Chancellor some sort of a question about gold bars. He says yes, and she says, regrettably, and then it's indistinct, they don't belong to us. And the Chancellor answers, some of them were sold, but we've still got some left. Let's have a listen to it.
I saw all the gold bars.
Yes.
Regrettably, some of them didn't belong to us.
Some of them are sold, but we've still got some left.
Now, the significance of that is perhaps that Gordon Brown, famously, when he was Chancellor, sold a lot of Britain's gold reserves at what turned out to be pretty rock-bottom prices.
Yes, and it's interesting, really, the fact that she was talking about the financial regulation, which was, of course, under the previous Labour government, and also the fact that some gold bars don't belong to us, in her word, regrettably. It does seem that some elements of financial management of the past, 15, 20 years, are on the monarch's mind at the moment.
Usually, when someone who's well known or terribly important goes into number 10, the press pack is shouting questions. But this morning, the press pack, if it's Her Majesty, you don't. You film it, you photograph it, and you let her do what she wants to do.
Behind the scenes, the Queen does have a role in the Constitution to advise and warn the Prime Minister of the day, and she does that in her weekly audience with the Prime Minister at Buckingham Palace. But it, of course, goes on behind closed doors, so we never know what is said. Many Prime Ministers say it's actually a very useful occasion for them because she acts as a kind of sounding board for things that they're worried about. And, of course, they know that the details of those meetings will never leak. And in this day and age, that's not something that politicians can bank on all the time.
But people have got a bit lax, you know? Complacency. Complacency. It's because the financial services, what do they call themselves? The regulator.
Financial Services
Authority. Which was really quite new, wasn't it? Really. But it didn't have any teeth.
There's another one coming in.
Yes.
Doesn't improve much, you know.
Like it or not, the Queen isn't just about handshakes and bouquets. What she says carries a lot of value. How much of an impact these comments will have is the million-pound question.
Because if you take a contrary view to the Queen, what do you do? Who do you vote for?